This past week, we got the chance to play an early build of Diablo IV, and after spending a bunch of time with the game, I'm happy to say it's looking pretty darn good. The build we had access to was limited. We were able to play through the prologue as well as all of Fractured Peaks, which is the first of the game's 5 open world zones. This included the full story campaign and cinematics, as well as side quest events and activities within that zone. We also could play 3 out of the 5 classes, choosing from the Rogue, Sorcerer, and Barbarian, which we could level to a maximum of 25 out of the game's 100 total character levels. And we also had access to multiplayer, letting us see other people within the game, group up and party, which I did with my editor Liam. And while this was limited and clearly an early build with plenty of work and progress stuff, and there is still plenty that we haven't seen, there was a lot to do, and I just wanted to keep on playing. And we in fact did just that. We played the game a ton, just about every day. We saw everything that this early build had to offer, scouring the entirety of the play space, going into every dungeon, doing every activity, participating in every event. And yeah, from what I've seen so far, Diablo IV is looking like just some plain old good fun. Now, unfortunately, we couldn't capture our own footage because this is an early build. It's still got the watermark plastered all over it, but we do at least have a bunch of new gameplay B-roll that we can show you, and I am able to fully talk about my experience, my playtime, what I saw, and what I thought. So let's go ahead and do just that. So starting things off, we can make our own character, of course. I chose the Barbarian out of the 3 available classes. I also played a little bit of the Sorceress, and Liam played and spent some time on all 3 of them as well. Making a character, there's customization. You can choose a few different face, body, hair, accessories, and coloring options. Not exactly crazy in depth, but honestly good enough for me, especially since I never even see any of this stuff playing in a top-down game, so it doesn't bother me all that much. And then after picking the character name, you must select a mode. It is defaulted to normal. There was also the option to select hardcore. And of course, eventually, once seasons roll in, there will be a seasonal option here as well. And then before jumping in, you select your difficulty, which is just the first 2 world tiers. If you are even remotely familiar with ARPGs, just choose world tier 2. It's not that difficult, really. Okay, so after making a character, the game opens up with a cinematic. I won't spoil any of this here for those of you who care about the story stuff, but once the cinematic concluded, we are dropped off in Icehall Taiga. It is dark, it is snowy, we appear to be in the midst of a snowstorm. We go through the woods, fighting back some wolves, until we discover a nearby village, which, surprise, surprise, there are people there in trouble. We continue doing the prologue, and this concluded by introducing us to the first major town. This is Kiovashad, and yeah, this was a large establishment with every major type of vendor, as well as also acting as a social hub where you can see other players. And then from there, the game just kind of opened up with the full-blown open world to explore. In fact, come official release, you'll have a branching path at this point. You go through the story, and then the prologue concludes, and then you can choose where to go to continue the main quest. It essentially points you to the first 3 early zones. Besides the one you start off in, there's 2 additional ones, and you can just tackle it in whatever manner you want. Our build, however, as I mentioned, was limited, and we only had access to the very first zone, the Fractured Peaks, so we just begun exploring around. Now, in your first playthrough, you'll of course have that main story quest line taking you through the major events of the story. But aside from that, aside from those main story quests, Diablo IV is just a full-on open world game with much of the open world RPG trappings that you expect. I would say even just this first zone that we had was very large. It consisted of various open spaces with interconnected corridors. I think that's the best way to describe it. The zone was mostly made up of intertwining paths that would kind of loop into each other, interconnect above and below, and then occasionally they might open up a little bit to a somewhat wider space. That's not even a criticism, that's just kind of a description of the layout. I actually quite liked it, and like I mentioned, I still think it all felt very immersive, mainly because there's no loading screens and you're just going around doing your thing and coming across stuff and seeing all sorts of stuff, which there's a lot of different stuff to see. As you're going around, you'll of course come across groups of enemies, normal and elite varieties. There were demons, fallen, different skeletons, vampires, werewolves, spiders, pretty solid variety, and I am going to assume that the variety changes as well in each of the zones because they consist of different biomes. We'll see probably some crossover, but I expect new and different enemy types in the other zones in the game as well. And then there's environmental stuff. You'll find like barrels and wagons and different debris that you can craft crash through. Sometimes stuff will pop out of it. There will, of course, be chests to open up as well. I noticed a bunch of random stuff that would just happen out in the world too, and this is different from public events. Like at one point, I was walking along in one of the more open field areas when all of a sudden I found myself encased in this circular bone prison, and then a bunch of skeletons rose up out of the ground and started attacking me. And again, this wasn't like a public event. This was just a thing that happened as I was walking around. Something else similar, one time I was going down one of the narrow paths and I noticed some spider webs on the ground. I walked over one, it rooted me, and then spiders summoned in, descending from the sky and started attacking. So it was kind of cool to have these dynamic things rather than just like walking across and seeing a group of enemies and walking towards it, having things where enemies and stuff would just happen to you as you're moving. I found that pretty interesting. And there's also just a ton of different activities and things to do. Dungeons, public events, strongholds, side quests, of course. There's resource gathering because the game does have crafting systems, various collectibles, there are account-wide upgrade shrines, so on and so on. And I want to go into a bit of each of those systems, starting with my favorite, the dungeons. In any RPG, be it MMO or action, these are always some of my favorite types of content. Really, nothing beats a good old dungeon dive for me. Just going in, fighting a variety of monsters in this spooky looking place, and then collecting some loot. Diablo IV has a lot of it. They have well over 100 dungeons, in fact. The first zone alone had 23 to be exact, which felt like quite a lot, even after playing for several hours, which is how long it took us to complete the main story quest for that zone. We had only done 5 dungeons, so there were still 18 for us to discover, which I was astonished because I felt like I'd done a lot of dungeons, but it turned out some of the things that I thought were dungeons were just part of the main story quest. There's a lot of like side dungeons, and they mix in size and duration to complete, but some of them are quite expansive. In terms of dungeon appearance, it ran the gambit of different types, mostly themed around the zone being this like dark wintry setting. There were dank basements, ice caves, different castle locations, catacombs. There were even some outdoor dungeons, ones that were themed to be like out in the deep woods, for example. They all have a similar structure. You will enter the first floor, complete some objective, then go through additional floors, and many times fight a boss at the end. Although I should mention, not every single dungeon ends in a boss. Some of them just have these big events for you to complete, and then when you do the final stage of the event, the dungeon is over. So let me give you an example. One of the early dungeons we did was called the Defiled Catacombs. As we first entered the starting floor, it asked us to slay all of the enemies. As you get close to the final few, it'll reveal them on the map and tell you how many you have left. These were mostly skeletons on the first floor. And then we moved into the second level called the Spiral Crypts, and there we had to find and slay this gatekeeper. He was a big, tough skeleton, cold enchanted, had a lot of health, just had to work through him. Killing him let us collect a key, and that key let us open the door to these catacombs, inside of which we found the lair of the Brood Guard Vraish. This was a massive spider boss. He would spawn webs all over the room, spit poison pools, and would summon in hordes of spiders. Boss dropped loot, of course, duh, but then also completing that first official dungeon unlocked what was called the Aspect of Tampering Blows, which is basically this game's version of legendary powers. Every single dungeon in the game will unlock a specific aspect. So a dungeon has one unique aspect tied to it, and then that aspect is basically like legendary gear power that you can imbue on your gear. So yeah, we got over 100 dungeons, 23 in the first zone. You go through, you do stuff, you kill a boss, sometimes you don't. The dungeons will also have various events. We saw stuff like Cursed Chest, where you got to kill a bunch of enemies. If you kill a high number, you'll unlock a mastery, which gives you bonuses. There's also shrines, just like in Diablo 3. These will offer powerful temporary benefits. They seem to last somewhere around 30 seconds. I don't think I got an exact count, but somewhere in that ballpark. There were greed shrines, where everything you kill with that buff will drop additional coin. There's shrines for endless ability usage, guaranteed critical strikes. There's also stuff like curse shrines. So sometimes you'll go to a shrine and instead of getting a buff, first you gotta fight a bunch of enemies. The game also had these things called crack shrines, where you would find like the top of the shrine somewhere in a side room. You pick it up, bring it to the shrine, then the shrine's complete and you can activate it. It just adds to variety, basically. It gives you another thing to encounter potentially as you go through a dungeon. A couple times while in the dungeons, we came across a treasure goblin. Any Diablo fans will know what this is. You kill it, it drops a ton of loot. And I would just say generally, I really liked the dungeons. I really liked the experience. As I mentioned, mentioned, it is a type of content in RPGs that I generally enjoy. Yeah, there seems like there are a lot of them in Diablo 4. My biggest critique, though, is the fact that it appears the dungeon bosses repeat fairly often. Of the 23 dungeons that we went through, I would say, we didn't get an exact count, but I want to say there's somewhere in the ballpark of 8 to 12 bosses, and a few of those repeated, and a few of the dungeons just didn't have bosses. I was surprised to see repeated bosses at the end of dungeons. I guess because there are over 100 dungeons in the game, maybe it's too much to expect a unique boss in most of them, at least the ones that have boss fights, but it wasn't the case. We fought the exact same boss type in multiple different dungeon locations. You should just know that's something that happens. All right, stepping out of the dungeons back into the open world, let's talk about public events. If you played MMOs or you played online games with semi-shared world things, you probably know what a public event is. It's something you can come across, multiple people can engage in it, and you're tasked with doing some sort of activity. These will be displayed on your map as a little red ring. As you're walking by it, you'll just see like this semi-translucent red ring in an area that tells you a public event is over here. So there are quite a few different types of public events. I'll give you a few examples. We saw these ones called blood altars, where you would have to stand on pressure plates, and if you kill enemies near them, it fills them up with blood. You fill all of them, you fight a boss at the end. There were combat altars, which are just like horde modes, defend against a bunch of enemies, collect 30 souls, summon the boss, kill the boss. We saw one where you had to escort this really creepy child around to different locations that they tried to look for their father. There were liberation events where you'd come across these captives that you would have to save and clear enemies. You get the picture. You go to the area, you do the thing, you get the loot. Completing any public event would give you a chest with rewards. They will also all have masteries, which is just some bonus for you to complete for extra rewards. And also the public events reward what are called these murmuring orbs, and this is the currency that's used for the gambling vendor. The locations of the public events do appear to be static. Every time we went by the same areas, there would always be a public event there, but the exact event at those locations does appear to change, at least for some of them. I can't confirm this for every single public event location, but we did come across numerous ones that would cycle through different types of public events, even though they were in the exact same location. Another major piece of content within the open world is the Stronghold system. So there were 3 strongholds in that first zone, Fractured Peaks, and these are basically elaborate, kind of more drawn out events that you play through, and then once completed, change the area, unlocking new stuff. So they can change into towns, event hubs, or even dungeon locations. And then there was the actual world boss. Now there was one world boss in this build that we played, and he was located on the far eastern side of the zone. So the boss's name was Ashava the Pestilent. 5 minutes prior to spawning in, we noticed a countdown timer that went up on the map, and then going to the area, what we saw was this like giant spawning pool. It was a big gaping hole with fleshy bits and teeth and a pool of liquid in the middle. After the 5 minutes counted down, he summoned up out of the pool. It's like this massive bird-like monstrosity. We've actually seen this in some of the early footage of boss fights for Diablo 4. He's got a beak, lots of spikes, and these 2 large, long talons, and he had a few abilities from what we saw. For one, he would jam his talon into the ground and then swoop it in a big arc. This turned out to one-shot us if we got hit by any part of it, so we figured, okay, let's just go up and fight him up close. However, as you try to walk towards him, he will leap away from the group, forcing you to run closer, otherwise you'll get hit with that big talon one-shot swipe. But once you do that, he's got a forward lunge, which he will bite with his beak, which also happened to one-shot us. He would smash his arm directly underneath him, dealing damage in a telegraphed area. And after getting past the first of 4 health segments, he then started leaving pools of poison on the ground, which did a ton of damage as well. Now the boss is on a timer. We had 15 minutes in order to kill him. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. It was just me and Liam. Outside of the fact that half of his abilities would one-shot us, we were underleveled and we didn't have the damage. We got him to like, I would say about 3/4 if I'm being generous. We got him to about 3/4 of his health, and yeah, and then 15 minutes went by. We didn't kill him. We died a lot. He despawned, and we got a little bit of rewards. They gave us some experience and gold, but no loot, nothing like that, which was a bit of a shame. I would have liked to see what it was like to kill him, but we were simply underleveled, and this event doesn't appear to have had a ton of people invited. I mean, I think there was over 100 people, but we weren't all online at the same time. We weren't all in the same instances at the same time. Okay, so those are the main activities. There's a ton of other stuff that you could see and do in the open world as well. For one, there were these things called Altars of Lilith. These would grant you a permanent stat boost across all of your characters, giving you plus to things like strength, intelligence, or dexterity, and there's a ton of these to collect. There are also the cellars that I talk about. They're very, very small locations. Every single one we found has just been a single room. There'll be a handful of enemies as well as one mini boss to clear. It's just another opportunity for loot, sort of just like opening a chest. In fact, Liam got a legendary bow from one of those early level 5 sellers. So clearly you can still get good loot in these things. There's a bunch of collectible resources. You will find things like ore, berries, and stuff like that to pick up. It's pretty simple. You just click on it, something drops, and then you walk over it. There were also these things that I want to call open world shrines. They're different from the dungeon shrines in that, for one, they're not marked on the map, but two, you also need to use an emote. So you'll walk up to these statues and they'll have a plaque on them, and then you click on the plaque and it gives you kind of like a riddle that basically informs you which emote you should use. That's basically it. It's like more of an interactive shrine. Like some will say, if you greet this, you will get a buff. I don't know. A little more eloquent than that. But yeah, you'll get a cryptic message that hints at which one of the emotes you should use, which, speaking of which, yes, Diablo 4 has emotes. You stand in front of them, you do the proper emote, and you get a buff. We got buffs like increased movement speed. We got ones that made us invisible. There's ones that summon a little dog follower to follow you around. It's pretty cool, pretty interesting. And again, just kind of more variety and more different things to engage with in the game. And pretty much all of this stuff that we've been talking about also plays into this thing called region-wide progression. Whenever you do quests or discover locations or just engage with stuff within a region, this will earn you renown, which is like an experience used to unlock various rewards. This also kind of acts as a tracker for all of the major activities in each zone. So within the Fractured Peaks, for the region progress, we had to unlock 7 waypoints, 3 strongholds, 24 side quests, 83 areas to discover, 23 side dungeons, and 28 altars of Lilith. As you do these things, you get that renown and it levels you up, and then there are multiple tiers of rewards. So yeah, this is just like another form of progression, another thing to do in the game, thing to track, thing to go towards, but that also plays into your progression because you're getting skill points, you're getting potion charges, and you're getting paragon points. I do want to briefly touch on the town. The towns in the game, from what we saw, it looks like every zone will have one major town and then a handful of smaller towns. The smaller towns will have just a couple of different vendors and a waypoint. The major town will have every type of useful vendor, which includes a blacksmith where you can salvage, repair, and upgrade your gear. There's a weapons and armor vendor, which will sell weapons and armor on 30-minute rotating stock. There's the jeweler where you can go to craft gems, socket, unsocket, and upgrade. The alchemist where you go for potions. And then there's the occultist. This is a very important vendor because this is where you will imprint your aspects, which are like your legendary powers. It's also where you go to for sigils, which are basically the keys for the game's nightmare dungeons. And then finally, the major town will have the shady vendor, and this is where you go to gamble using those murmuring orbs that you get from the public events. I know we've covered a lot, but there's a couple more things I want to touch on before we wrap up the video. First, I want to briefly talk about the skill tree. Now, the way the skill tree works is you will start at the very top, and then by spending points, you unlock access to lower tiers, and you move your way down through these different clumps of abilities. So you start off with basic abilities, which for me, that was my resource generator, and then in the second tier, you get your core abilities, which are your major damage dealing resource spenders. Tier 3 were defensive abilities, tier 4 brawling, tier 5 weapon mastery, and then there are your ultimate abilities, and finally there is a tier of these powerful nodes with really good passive buffs. And every class looks to go through that simple progression of basic into core, into 3 class specific branches, and then ultimate, and then those final buff nodes. And within each of those cores, you will have the abilities you have access to, and then branching from them is further specification. We'll probably do some videos going into more details for each of the classes, or at least some of the classes that we played. Now let's talk about loot. Wouldn't be an ARPG if we didn't talk about loot, because loot's a big part of the game. So items in D4 will have much of the basic RPG stats you expect. There'll be boosts to primary stats, as well as various modifiers, more or less changing things like your damage and your defensives, just at different specific points. And then armor pieces in the game can give you plus ranks to skills, and this is really huge for building and making builds in the game, trying to get gear with as much plus skill ranks as possible to boost up your abilities beyond the natural cap of just spending points, which are capped at 500 of 5. And these can actually be for individual skills or for all skills in an entire category. But of course, the real interesting loot modification comes from the legendary powers. As you expect, you will have legendary items that drop, and they can have some really cool abilities. We saw ones like during the Inferno ultimate, you'd call down meteors that would set fire and immobilize enemies. Or we saw one where when you got struck, there was a magic bubble that would form around you, pushing enemies back, and then it would stay there for 8 seconds and absorb 900 HP, which was like double the character's health at the time. Kind of crazy. All sorts of different really cool stuff. But the legendary system also plays into these aspects. So aspects are basically legendary powers that you unlock by completing the dungeons, like we touched on earlier, and then you can just apply them to your gear. So there are 115 aspects in the game currently. They're broken into 5 different categories. These are defensive, offensive, resource, utility, and mobility. And each category can be applied to specific gear types. As an example, the mobility category can be enchanted onto boots and amulets. The offensive category can go on amulets, weapons, gloves, and rings. And every category will have a set selection of armor that it can be enchanted on. Now, most of these that you unlock by going through the dungeons will be class specific, but there's also some general ones as well. So a few class specific examples for my barbarian, I had the aspect of anemia, which made it so that direct damage against bleeding enemies would have a 31% chance to stun them for 2 seconds. And then I had the slacking aspect, which made it so that I have a 30% chance to gain 20 fury when rend deals damage to at least 1 bleeding enemy. So I played a rend bleeding build. I would bleed them, I would keep swiping and get my 30% chance for fury regeneration, and then I would hit them and have a 31% chance to stun them for 2 seconds. It was quite strong, honestly. It felt really, really powerful. But then there are some more generic abilities like the aspect of the protector, which would make it so that every 10 seconds you would gain a personal barrier. And as I mentioned, 115 aspects in the game. I'm just going to assume then that means that there are exactly 115 dungeons, because yes, every single dungeon unlocked a single aspect. What I am curious about though is if there is any loot in the game that has powers that aren't tied to the dungeons, because besides unlocking these powers for continual use and enchanting your gear with, you can also pull the power out of an item and basically get a one-time use of that item. So that does have me curious if they do intend to have more than 115 legendary powers basically, but just not have all of them be tied to this aspect system that you unlock through dungeons. I guess we'll have to see. A couple of other interesting things that we noticed while playing the game. When you go AFK, you get a little Z sleepy icon over your character. I thought that was kind of funny and felt very MMO-y. The game has challenges. These are sort of like achievements. You do something special, you earn a title. There are tons of these. There's also clans in the game, very similar to how guilds work in WoW. You join a clan, you'll see a list of members. There's a news feed, a message of the day, and there's even a voice chat. And yes, this game does have in-game VoIP systems. I will say I had a really good time with this, but as much as I liked the build, there was a lot not in the build. Anything past the first zone, like I said, there are 5 total zones, but we only had access to the Fractured Peaks. There were no PvP areas, and that is because there are no PvP zones within the Fractured Peaks. All of them are somewhere beyond that. We also saw exactly 0 endgame content. No Nightmare Dungeons, no Helltide events, no access to the Tree of Whisper system. There was no Paragon board, which felt like well, just really disappointing not getting to take a look at the Paragon board in this preview. A lot of the game's customization and endgame progression, as far as we know, will come from this, so would have liked to see it. Guess I'm gonna have to wait. And then also, there wasn't any mounts. Apparently, you will be unlocking the mounts in the main game after finishing the campaign. So since we couldn't finish the campaign, we didn't get to use mounts. Overall, I had a really good time. I think D4 is shaping up quite nice. If nothing else, it feels really great to play. It's really interesting to see an open world Diablo game. And I think there is a ton of potential depending on how the endgame systems play out, how the rest of the zones are, how the PvP zones are. There's a lot of stuff. But then also there, even just from what we played, there were some criticisms that we had. There was some of what I'm just going to assume is work in progress. This is still an early build. My character would constantly tweak out when attempting to target an enemy with an ability. I would try to use a skill clicking on a character, and my character would spin in circles for 1 or 2 seconds as they were trying to find the character and line them up. It happened often enough that it was noticeable and a bit annoying. Also, the fact that the dungeon bosses are reused so often. Of the 23 dungeons, I swear we only saw at most 10 bosses, and we fought the same boss repeatedly in a few of those dungeons. Also, my editor Liam just wants to send out a complaint that there's no WASD movement. Personally, I like to click to move, but I know there's a lot of people who do like WASD, and it's actually confusing why they don't have it as an option in this game, because they're going to support controllers, and that is the same concept. You're using one thing to move, one thing to aim. If you support controllers and you're coming to consoles, which you are, why not also have WASD movement? Maybe it's happening. Maybe they've announced it. Maybe it was in there and we didn't just see it. But if not, you should add WASD movement because you have controller support. So of course you should. And then of course I should say there are still a lot of questions. One of the biggest questions and potential concerns we have is how much variety is there? Will there be more variety in world events, in world bosses, in enemy types within the different zones? I'm going to assume yes, but we don't know for certain, and we won't know for certain until we get some more playtime with it. But after spending the past week with the game, I'm definitely going to be playing it. All of the usual caveats and just points that to make about Blizzard in general. If you don't like or want to support Blizzard anymore, I understand. If you don't think Blizzard makes good games anymore, or you're worried about their monetization, I agree and understand as well. As far as a gameplay experience, my time with it was very positive. I liked playing. I wanted to keep playing. I'm looking forward to playing again, and I hope I get to play again. I mean, I will whenever they release it. Sometime after this video uploads, I'm sure we're going to be getting a release date. That's the expectation. I don't know one way or the other at this point in time as of this recording. I'm not sure, but we're assuming we're getting the release date very, very soon. And it's rumored to be in April. All right, I'll play this game in April, just as long as the cash shop isn't total garbage. I'll probably play it even if the cash shop is total garbage. I won't engage with it, and I'll complain about the cash shop. If I'm being honest, that's probably what will happen. That does it for me today. Thank you for joining me. We played a lot of Diablo 4. We really liked it, and I'm looking forward to playing more. Thanks, guys. I'll see you later. Take it easy.